Buddy, I'm RJ Marquez. It's Tuesday night, and that means we have another KSAT Explains live stream Q&A headed your way. Tonight, we are going to show you a small part of our special on the killer nurse, Janine Jones. And then afterward, we're going to talk live to the recently retired Paul Venema about covering this gripping trial for KSAT 12 for years. So stick around for that. Paul, of course, always has an interesting perspective and was featured throughout this special, which you can find on KSAT.com. But first, Janine Jones. She was convicted of killing 2 infants by injecting them with powerful drugs while they were in her care in Kerrville and San Antonio. She's suspected of killing dozens more babies, but it's highly unlikely she will ever be tried in all of the cases in which she is accused. That's because Jones is serving a life sentence after she was convicted in a Bexar County courtroom last year. And she won't be eligible for parole until she's in her late 80s. So let's take a look back at the day the Jones case broke open.
Dr. Holland, who was a brand new pediatrician, just opened her practice, was in search of a nurse, and hired Janine Jones immediately for her pediatric clinic in Kerrville.
And in a period of 1 month, 8 kids had 9 separate emergencies and were rushed to the ER because they had stopped breathing. That was pretty hard to miss.
Many children under their care had been developing some respiratory issues, and in each case, Janine Jones would somehow bring these children out of whatever episode they were dealing with.
Their medical problems went from 0 to 120 miles an hour, in an instant. They came in with colds and flus for a routine baby checkup or shot, and suddenly they stopped breathing.
As I recall, the way it surfaced here in Kerrville is that we had a death of a child, Chelsea McClellan. Other physicians were saying, this is not normal. This is not what happens in a physician's office.
In Kerrville, in the Sid Peterson Hospital, the little hospital there, they usually see retirees. They don't see kids.
What had happened is that Chelsea McClellan had suffered what had been described as a respiratory arrest in the office of Dr. Kathleen Holland. She had been transported to Sid Peterson Hospital. And of course, there was a code called over the hospital loudspeaker that basically was, any medical personnel in the area respond to the code. And so happens that one of the physicians that responded, a man named Dr. Frank Bradley, who was an anesthesiologist.
An anesthesiologist identified the pattern of behavior from the child as though she were coming out from a drug called succinylcholine.
Succinylcholine is a muscle paralytic that is usually used to paralyze someone's muscles for surgery or if they have to be intubated or something like that. If you were to inject it in a person, in a baby, it would just paralyze all of their muscles, including the diaphragm, which is the muscle that you have to use to breathe. So it would essentially just stop respiration, and then probably they would go into cardiac arrest as a result.
That's what made people all of a sudden pay attention. What is this drug? What's this child getting this drug for? And then the investigation began. Inquiries are made in Dr. Holland's office, and they find out that, in fact, she did have succinylcholine in her office. It had been ordered by her nurse, Janine Jones.
She checked her supply of succinylcholine and found that there had been a vial of succinylcholine missing. She asked Jones about it. She said, I don't know what happened to it, just say we lost it. Later, a bottle did turn up. She immediately became suspicious when she started putting 2 and 2 together. So she turned that vial over to Texas Rangers, and that's how that began to tie Jones into the death of Chelsea McClellan.
Then the problem began as we understood the way that succinylcholine worked, is that it began breaking up in the body almost immediately. Then the next step began to be, how can we prove that this child was in fact given that drug? And the initial autopsy report came back as sudden infant death syndrome. It wasn't until later, when the possibility of succinylcholine being introduced, that the medical examiner's office went back and said, wait a minute, all bets are off. We then pursued exhumation, knowing that we had somebody that would test the tissue. And that's a day that I won't forget. I mean, I still remember it very well. I was 30 or so years old and single and no children. I really hadn't put a lot of thought into what I was getting ready to do at that point in time. The first thing that I noticed immediately was the smell. And I know that's difficult to say, but that was my first experience with smelling decomposition. It was very unnerving for me. I wasn't sure what to expect, and I felt very strongly that I needed to participate in every aspect of this. But boy, I was having second thoughts about it at that time. It was like seeing a large doll on a table with a stuffed animal and a baby blanket. And I remember having to remind myself that that's not a doll, that's a human being. And I can tell you where at the cemetery it happened, I can tell you what people were wearing, I can tell you where I parked the car. It stuck with me that much. It was a traumatic day.
Okay, so some very powerful stuff from Scott Monroe there. He's the former district attorney for Kerr County. And joining us now is Paul Venema. Of course, you all remember him, longtime KSAT reporter and anchor. Paul recently retired, but was gracious enough to join us for this Q&A. Paul, thank you very much. Before we get to life after KSAT, you look good, by the way. Retirement's treating you well early on. We wanted to bring you in to talk more about this trial, Janine Jones, obviously a trial that gripped South Texas for years. First of all, what do you remember most about when that trial started after the piece that we just saw?
Well, it was interesting from a couple of standpoints. Personally, one of them is the clinical aspect of it. You heard Scott talking about the testimony of Dr. Bo Holmstead, a doctor from Sweden, and they really got into, I mean, you had to be trained in the sciences almost to understand his testimony, but you didn't have to be trained in the sciences to understand the significance of his testimony. He was able to develop a system with a gas chronometer, and beyond that, I can't, like I said, his testimony was loaded with a lot of big medical multi-syllable words. In any event, he had a method that he developed in which he could identify succinylcholine in human tissue. So that's, and you heard Scott talking about the exhumation, and so that was the key to bringing this whole succinylcholine element into the Chelsea McClellan case. It was Dr. Holmstead's testimony. But interesting enough, so the prosecution learned of Dr. Homestead, and they found out that he was attending a convention rather, in San Diego. They flew out to San Diego, visited with him, explained what they were interested in his research was, and he agreed to testify on one condition, and that was that this would not be a death penalty case. He was opposed to capital punishment. So, and at that point, this was not a death penalty case because the case did not at that time qualify as a capital murder death penalty case. So that set aside, he agreed to come and testify, and that, to me, from a purely clinical standpoint, was a turning point in this trial and in this case. The second thing I think that I take away from the trial is the emotional aspect of it, and that involves the testimony of Chelsea McClellan's mother, Petty McClellan.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned Petty, and we'll go ahead and go right there with Petty McClellan. Obviously, we've heard your stories, heard from Scott Monroe about this. Very emotional testimony there. She became a fierce advocate for other mothers that were alleged victims of Janine Jones, and also just sort of the face of this entire trial. So what do you remember most about Petty being in the courtroom when she was able to take the stand and basically testify against Janine Jones?
You know, RJ, I've covered a ton of trials, and you see a lot of emotion. That's what trials are all about. But never since then and before then have I ever heard any testimony that was so emotional as hers. And you can imagine, it's a mother whose child is the victim in this case, and she talked about what led up to her daughter's death. It talked about that visit to Kathleen Holland's clinic there in Kerrville for just a routine checkup, and then holding Chelsea while Janine Jones, and she describes it, actually injected her, which she would later learn was the drug that caused her death. But just her testimony throughout was just gripping. Once she got, like I said, she took the thing chronologically. Once she got to the point of the actual injection, it was all bets were off. I mean, it was just gut-wrenching, emotional testimony. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. I mean, the judge, the jury, the spectators. It was a small courtroom. They'd alternated courtrooms during the trial, and on this particular day, it was in the smaller of the courtrooms, and it was everyone in that courtroom was in tears listening to this mother describe the death of her 15-month-old infant daughter. It was something that will stay with me forever in terms of what I've seen and heard in courtrooms. It was just horrible. But here's the thing that really struck me was the fact that of all the people in the courtroom, including defense attorneys, there was one person who didn't shed a tear, and that was Janine Jones.
Yeah, that is unbelievable, Paul. Of course, this story, the Janine Jones story, gained national attention. What do you remember about that? Just the awareness across the country about this. I mean, this really became a huge story across the country. And at the time, there was no social media. The internet presence was not there. But it seemed like really there was just a ton of attention on this one trial.
There was indeed, and there was always a call. As the people were watching this, is why isn't this a death penalty case? Why in the world is this woman facing 99 years, which is, in effect is life in prison? Why didn't she get the death penalty when she was convicted? And that's because at that point, the death of a child was not what you call it didn't qualify as a death penalty case according to Texas law. At that time, the only death penalty cases were cases involving the death of a police officer while in the line of duty, or a crime that was committed along with another crime, a robbery, and you killed somebody during a robbery. But the death of a child was not a capital murder case and not punishable by death. The laws have since changed, and now it is. At one point it was 6 years. I believe it's up to 10 or 12 years now. So that if that case were tried today, it would have been a death penalty case, and just in all likelihood, I think she probably would have received the death penalty. Because there was just, like you mentioned, attention to this case nationwide, and the attention that it received, the nature of the case itself, the horrible death of a child. I think probably, in all likelihood, and that's just a guess, but just in all likelihood, this would have been a death penalty case, and I think she probably would have been given the death.
Right, and that is some incredible perspective there, Paul. I think that there were so many cases, so many babies, so many cases that Janine Jones was not tried for. Do you feel that in the end, even though she will probably never see the light of day again, spend her entire life behind bars, do you feel that ultimately justice was served in this case?
That's kind of a subjective question, and given the way the law was structured at the time, I think probably justice was served. That's, like I said a moment ago, she got the most that the law would allow at that time. Were the case tried again today, I think she would have gotten the death penalty. But again, it's a matter of what you consider justice from whoever's perspective. And from the victims' families, perhaps they will never consider having justice served. So it's like I say, it's a matter of perspective, kind of a subjective question. But in my opinion, I think that given what the law was at the time, that's the best they could do.
Yeah, Paul, and you were talking about the death penalty. Switching gears a little bit, obviously we are in the midst of another high-profile trial taking place right now, the Otis McCain trial. He's accused of the shooting, fatally shooting SAPD detective Benjamin Marconi. Now, Paul, you had covered this case extensively before you retired, so you went to the first day of the trial here. What sort of compelled you to go down there and take part in what was the first day of Otis McCain's trial?
I guess the best way to describe it is the career that I've chosen, that we've chosen, is something that you live. And I, as you mentioned, I followed this case forever. And so it was just personal for me more than anything else to go down there and get this thing kicked off and to watch what I had seen progressing, all the pre-trial stuff and the big delay because of COVID. It was something that has been around. The crime itself was committed in 2016, so it's been around for 5 years. And it was just something that, from a personal standpoint, I wanted to see through. And I probably will drop in from time to time as a spectator now and observe the case, simply because it's something that I was deeply involved in, and I want to stay on top of this case, though I'm not going to be doing any reporting on it. It's like I said, you start to, these cases that you cover begin to take on a life of their own and become a part of your life, like it or not. So that would explain my presence. I guess you could call me a junkie.
Right. And of course, obviously, you made these lifelong relationships and friendships with everyone there at the courthouse. So I'm sure that they were beyond thrilled to get to see you and maybe get to kind of catch up a little bit. So, Paul, for people.
Also, RJ, there's, you mentioned the people. This case involves some terrific lawyers. And when you strip everything away, it's nice from my perspective to see some really, really good lawyering going on. And that's going to be the case. And from that standpoint, I also find it interesting. The defense attorneys are the top shelf guys as far as capital murder cases are, and the prosecutors are way up in there in the DA's office with tons of experience. And there's just really, really good attorneys involved on both sides. So it'll be an interesting case to watch, simply from a legal standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've been following, paying attention. What has kind of stood out from the first couple of days of the trial?
Well, Catherine, Tamara Strauss gave the opening statement for the prosecution and gave a 1 hour plus blow by blow account of the crime, laid out their case, and just laid out a real solid case. And the defense, to the point that they opted, and I think it was a good decision, not to make an opening statement, because that would have been a tough act to follow from the defense. So it was interesting that the defense did not make an opening statement, but you can be sure that they'll have something to say once the state presents its case, because they've got an uphill battle because of the nature of the case and the facts of the case. It's going to be the reality, RJ, is that this really is not a guilt-innocent case so much as it's a punishment case, because guilt-innocence is going to be easy to prove, if you will, if you can say there's a case easy to prove. It won't be a real challenging case because everything has been put together so well, and they've been able to document this case all the way through. So the challenge is going to be for the defense. They've got to come up with some kind of mitigating evidence when it's their turn. Should, of course, I'm assuming that there will be a conviction. If there is conviction, they've got a challenge to come up with some mitigating evidence to keep Otis McCain alive, because it's a good solid case, and it's going to be a challenge for them to get him to keep from being executed. So they've got their work cut out for them. Both sides obviously have, because you take nothing for granted in a case like this. I mean, a capital murder case, it's everything is on the line. So there's no easy capital murder case trial, and there's so much at stake. So you can bet it's going to be a real interesting case, just from a legal standpoint, to see it tried.
Yeah, that is some great perspective, Paul. We know you will continue to cover this. So for people watching this live stream right now, I'm sure they have several questions for you. Probably the biggest one is just how are you doing? Obviously, a long, very fruitful career at KSAT 12. So just how are things going right now?
Right now, I'm in the process of decompressing, and RJ, it's a lot of fun. I've got a supportive family that I have had throughout my career, and I owe them a ton. And now I'm theirs, and I'm trying to do my best to make up for some of the time that lost in this consuming career that I had, and just enjoying my wife and my daughters a lot, and spending as much time as I can trying to do as many honeydews as Sonia will put before me, and we're going to do some traveling later on this summer. So just doing things that I should have been doing for a long time, and trying to make up for some of that, as well as looking forward to having some fun. You know, it's time. It's my time, okay? It's time to have fun, and it's the family's time. So that's become my priority is enjoying time with my family.
Yeah, absolutely. Underrated part of this business is that sometimes, things with family maybe get put aside just because of the news cycle. But yeah, definitely always appreciative of that part of it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know what I'm talking about. And like I say, they've supported me throughout this career of mine. And now it's time for me to spend some time with them and support them and do what I can to make them happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Paul, well, you always have your KSAT family here. Thank you so much for the time. And as you mentioned, you're going to be popping into the courthouse every now and then for a few trials. Feel free to pop in here, of course, at the station as well. Paul, thank you very much for the time. You have a good night.
Sure, thank you. Bye-bye. And
thank you very much, guys. Again, if you want to watch In a Killer's Care, this is the Janine Jones special that we have had on our website. It is available to stream right now on all KSAT platforms and, of course, on KSAT.com. Thank you very much for being with us. You guys stay safe out there.